We're joined now in our Parliament House studio by Bjorn Lomberg, the Danish author of the international bestseller, The Skeptical Environmentalist. Thanks for being there.
It's good to be here, Tony.
You used to be sceptical about the potential impact of man-made global warming. Have you changed your mind on that?
Well, fundamentally, I'm skeptical about how we tackle it. I am also skeptical of the way it's often being portrayed as either the end of the world or it's not happening at all. Neither is true. It is a problem. Global warming is man-made. It is something we need to fix. But let's be quite frank. We're just not doing it, and we haven't been doing it for the last 20 years because we're essentially barking up the wrong tree. So it's much more a question of being skeptical of the political means that we try to use to tackle this problem.
Well, you've arrived in Australia just as the government has announced its plans for a carbon tax. What's your assessment of that?
Well, fundamentally, listen, if we want to tackle climate change, we got to realize any realistic carbon tax is just not going to do it. First of all, even if we have a substantial carbon tax, it's only going to reduce emissions a little. And of course, we're not going to get it in China and India and the US. Now, this doesn't mean that there's not a good academic argument to say, let's have a small carbon tax, but it is to recognize this is simply the sideshow. If we want to do something about global warming, it's not about trying to make fossil fuel so expensive nobody wants it, because that's never going to happen. It's about making green energy so cheap everyone wants it. And so it's really about innovation into green energy technology. And that we are very poor at, and we don't talk very much about. So I'm also here in Australia to simply talk about, let's spend a lot more in research and development into green energy, because that's going to be the solution.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but it does seem to me that you've indicated that a carbon tax is okay by you, provided the money raised from it goes into developing innovation in green energy.
Any economist would say global warming, CO2 is a bad, so you should tax it at its damage cost, which is, by the best peer-reviewed estimates that we have, about $7 per ton of carbon dioxide right now. So yes, a small carbon tax is fine, but the important point here is to recognize that is not going to solve global warming. And of course, again, it's not going to happen in China and India and many other places. So if you spend the money on research and development, that's the part that will really make the impact. It's not about the carbon tax. It's about the investment in research and development into green energy technology development.
Well, that's not the plan here. The plan is to raise the carbon tax and then give it back to people who are affected by rising energy prices.
Yes, and listen, there are many other things that politicians have to worry about, and you also have to worry about people being fuel poor. So clearly there are other considerations. I'm simply talking about, if you want to do something about global warming, it's not predominantly about the carbon tax. It's about making sure that you make green energy much cheaper. Listen, the simple point here is, right now, solar panels and other green energy sources cost a lot more than fossil fuels. Solar panels cost perhaps 10 times as much as fossil fuels. Now, you can get a few rich, well-meaning Westerners, put them up on their rooftops, feel good about themselves, but it's not going to solve global warming. But if we could innovate the price down of solar panels over the next 2 to 4 decades to be cheaper than fossil fuels, we would have solved global warming. Everyone, including the Chinese and the Indians, would switch. And so the real point is, stop talking about the sideshow and start talking about what would really make a big difference.
The counter-argument is that the current solution of putting a price on carbon pollution is it'll make fossil fuels more expensive and therefore make renewable energy more affordable, and so it'll shift investment on a large scale, and having done that, you'll then get economies of scale in the cost of those renewable energies.
Yes, and a lot of people are making that argument. Unfortunately, it's only slightly true. If you make fossil fuels more expensive, yes, people will switch slightly towards renewables. But what will essentially happen is that you're just buying a lot of inefficient technology today, simply with government subsidies. We've seen that in Germany and the Czech Republic and Spain and many other places. And fundamentally, what you end up doing is you create a false market, because as recession hits, then all these businesses collapse. And you're essentially spending lots of money getting the technology already knew wasn't working, instead of focusing on getting the new technology that'll work in the future. Let me just give you one example. Denmark has been a world leader in wind energy, where I come from, for the last 3 decades. We put up lots and lots of windmills in the 70s, 80s, early 90s. We felt incredibly proud about them, but they were incredibly inefficient. We've cut all of them down and replaced them with more efficient windmills. I'm simply pointing out, don't put up incredibly inefficient and vast volumes of incredibly inefficient green technologies. Put up a few to make the leap to the next generation, but focus on making those next generations rather than spending lots and lots of money on inefficient technology.
Well, you've made the argument about Germany, for example. I've heard you make that publicly, but surely the real question about Germany is not the impact that what happens there has on global warming over the whole planet. It's the impact it has on the amount of renewable energy that's used for electricity generation, in particular in Germany. And the percentages have changed dramatically. For example, in 2000, they had 6% of their energy come from electricity. A mere 9 years later, in 2009, it's up to 16%.
Sorry, and the question is?
Well, I'm just saying that they're moving towards changing their energy mix through these targets. In fact, their future targets are even higher. They plan to get to 35% by 2020.
And absolutely. But listen, Tony, the point here is to recognize we could basically shift all of the world to green energy right now. The technology is not the problem, in the sense that if cost doesn't matter, then we can do it today. We could do it with 1950s technology. The issue here is it's not going to happen as long as it's very, very expensive. And Germany is a good case for that. As long as they spend huge amounts of subsidies, and the biggest cost, of course, is with solar panels, which Germany is the biggest consumer per capita of in the world. They're essentially spending large sums of money to do very little for climate change. I would much rather see them spend that same money, for instance, on research and development, so that you would get large impacts in the long run. This is not about us feeling good. This is about making sure that we do good in the long run.
I've got to make the counter argument, because you say they're doing nothing to fix climate change overall, but in Germany, they're changing their mix of electricity, how they get their electricity, to renewables. In fact, if they do what they plan to get up to 35% by 2020, 80% by 2050, if every country did the same thing, you'd have a massive global shift, wouldn't you?
Listen, first of all, let's remember this is for electricity, what you were, the numbers that you were just talking about. They're not changing their cars. They're not changing many of the other productions and where we're using fossil fuels. Yes, everybody has great aspirational hopes for 2050, but of course, that's also a long ways away, and we have no reason to believe that that's actually going to come true. If we look at virtually all the promises that have been made until now for climate change, they've almost invariably not come true. So I would be very skeptical about that. But yes, if you place more CO2 neutral energy technologies, of course you are going to make a slight impact on global warming. But as long as you spend vast sums of money doing fairly little good, you're not actually going to get China and India and everybody else on board. You're just going to have those few countries do a little good. And you alluded to it, I'm sure you read it, but I'd like to just share this with the viewers. Actually, the German example, they've spent $75 billion on subsidizing solar panels, the net effect which will be to postpone global warming by the end of the century by 7 hours. That's not spending money smartly. That's simply throwing away money to feel good.
Yeah, but you're making the assumption there that no other country does the same thing that they do. Whereas if other countries did the same thing that they do, to get back to my earlier point, that would make a huge difference to the amount of CO2 expended throughout the world.
Well, Tony, fundamentally, if more countries did what Germany would do, yes, we would postpone it maybe by 21 hours, maybe even by 2 or 3 weeks. But of course, at a hugely increased cost. The trick here is, don't try to implement the expensive technologies today, but make sure that those technologies become so cheap that not just rich, well-meaning Westerners like Germans will put up a few solar panels that'll cover a couple % of their energy consumption, but make sure that it'll work for everyone.
Well, no, you're changing the figures. I just told you they're up to 16% now. They're going to 35% by 2020. This is for electricity generation, which is what produces the most
and
carbon.
So it's probably what 6 or 7% of their energy consumption.
Yes, but they do have similar but more realistic targets for the rest of their energy consumption. But let's move on, because the truth is that they are an early adopter of these solar technologies, so it's inevitably going to be more expensive, just like widescreen televisions were more expensive for the early adopters of widescreen televisions. In fact, what's happening in China is you're getting vast economies of scale now on solar panels, and they're going to be much cheaper in the future.
Well, listen, again, if we look, if I could just pick you up on that one, we do know the numbers for the European Union, not for Germany, but for the European Union. They're planning to cut their emissions 20% below 1990 levels by 2020. The macroeconomic models indicate that the cost of that, the average of all these macroeconomic models, indicate the cost will be about $250 billion a year. And the net effect, after having done that for 80 years till 2100, will be a reduction in temperature by 1/20th of 1 degree centigrade. Now, you're arguing that if we do all of that, then it'll become cheaper for future generations or for second adopters or for China later on. That is technically true, but the point is, of course, we didn't have to spend $250 billion to get there. We had to spend the money on the research and development, not on buying all the inefficient technology. And when we spend all that money, of course, what we're doing is essentially making it less likely that we will get to the next generations, because countries are going to run out of money, as we've seen many other countries and states do, and say there are other and more important priorities. So if you waste money now, it means that there'll be less money to care about global warming later on.
Once again, the counter-argument would be that if countries like India, China, and even the United States don't inevitably adopt a price on carbon, countries that do will impose border tariffs on their goods when they're sent into when they're imported, and so inevitably they will have a charge on their carbon in their manufacturing.
Well, I mean, in some ways, you just said yourself here, the countries that will do so, maybe Australia, maybe the EU, they will exclude the rest of the world. I mean, listen, it's us that would be excluding ourselves from the rest of the world. There's a much bigger danger here, which I think pretty much everyone recognizes, is that if we have a trade war, the losses for everyone could be hugely bigger, and that's probably why this will never happen. No, the argument is not to say we should have a carbon tax because it's going to make us more competitive. Sorry, it's not. If we put on a price of carbon tax, it is going to be more costly for us. Now, it may make sense, and I would argue, again, a $7 carbon tax makes economic sense, but it's not the main solution. And that's why I'm so concerned about how we're spending all our political capital and
we haven't got much time, so let's talk about your solution briefly. It is about increasing, as I understand it, government subsidies for research and development. The problem with that is governments tend to pick winners, as they've done in this country and in the United States with clean coal technology, which, for all the billions of dollars that's been spent on it, has yet to produce over a very long period of time a single commercially viable plant.
Absolutely. That's also true for a lot of other green energies. But let's be honest and say you should not have governments pick winners. I would envision, and that's why I helped organize something called the Copenhagen Consensus for Climate, where we asked the 28 of the world's top climate economists, 3 Nobel laureates, what are the smartest solutions to climate change? And they actually said, spend money on research and development, but spend it across the whole area. Spend it on all the different technologies. We shouldn't be picking winners. But the point is, because researchers are incredibly cheap, you can afford all of this at a cost of 0.2% of GDP. That would be about $1.6 billion for Australia. That would be a fairly little cost. It would be about about 5 times of what the Australia is spending right now. And the amazing thing is, we don't have to have all of those technologies come through. Most of them are probably going to fail, but that's okay if a few of them are going to become cheaper than fossil fuels over the next 20 to 40 years. Those are the ones that will power the 21st century.
But the only problem with this is, once again, your solution is a government-driven solution involving public money.
Well, listen, we do the exact same thing for medical science. We don't expect pharmaceuticals to make blue sky research or create Nobel laureates. We do this because there's a great public benefit for having studies into that. Then, of course, once you get the technology going, you will have pharmaceuticals pick up and make all the great things that'll actually prolong your and my life. But the same thing goes with government subsidies to, government investment in research and development into energy. If I am the inventor of this amazing technology that'll reduce the cost of solar panels by 50%. They'll still go from 10 times as expensive to 5 times as expensive. I won't be able to recoup that investment because it's only in 2 or 3 decades they'll become cheaper. That's why we need governments to invest, but they should invest smartly And fundamentally, we should make sure we spend it where we'll actually solve global warming and solve the problem of acidification and many other things, as we just saw, rather than having this conversation for another 10 years that's going to lead nowhere.
Bjorn Lomberg, always good to talk to you. We thank you very much for joining us again tonight.
Thank you.